Good evening, friends. Another Facebook Live talk on Delhi's history. And I hope that all of you are doing well and are surviving this long lockdown, quarantine, pandemic. We are all affected in many different ways. And I trust that you all are all healthy, safe, happy. And to keep us occupied, I have been doing a series of talks on Delhi's history, Delhi's architecture also, and this one is specifically on an aspect of Delhi's architecture, which is the history of the dome and the arch in Delhi. Um, this is an illustrated talk, so you will see a lot of images. I will try and make this as again, I'm trying to make it easy to understand for everybody, not a lot of technical terms. I hope I will go slow so that some of these nuances can be understood. And I think it's very important to understand some of these things, not only from the point of view of architecture, but about how it tells us a lot about how history has uh, the course of history in Delhi and how architecture is so tied up with not only culture and the arts, but also with the the social and political changes that have taken place in Delhi and in the wider country as well. So let's make a start. This image, of course, which you see is Tughlaqabad, from Tughlaqabad looking at Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq's tomb. I will move on. And before I go any further, I'd like to really talk about what is special about an arch. Now, in human history, the very first time people started putting up structures, and I'm talking here of structures made of stone. That is one of the older materials that have been used, and I'm talking about stone right now. And putting up stone, one way of putting up stone structures is to put up posts or columns, these pillars that you see on this graphic. These pillars are the posts, and there's a beam which is being supported by these columns, and that is called the lintel or simply a beam. Now, once you have this, how does this kind of a structure support weight? It's very simple. The weight comes from on top, and it comes from on top. It might be because there is the whole beam and posts are supporting a structure on top, or it may just be the weight of the beam itself. Now that is the weight is coming down, and the weight is really concentrated quite a bit in the middle of that beam, because the ends, if you see, are supported by those columns. So that, what you can see, the green arrows, that's where the compression is happening, where there's pressure on the stone. And that compression, the stone can actually put up with compression quite well. It's a very hard, strong material. It can put up with pressure very well. What it cannot really put up with quite so well is tension. And that tension is at the lower end of the beam. That's where, if it was, suppose there was wooden beams, and earlier we used to use a lot of wooden beams too, and a wooden beam would kind of bend a little bit. It would have a little elasticity, it would bend. That tension over there would cause it to bend. Now, the problem with stone is that stone does not have the elasticity of wood. So, when you make this kind of post and lintel construction in stone, you end up with a situation where beams like this tend to crack towards the lower part of the stone where you have that beam. As a result, the only way of really offsetting that is to not take very long beams. Keep your beam short, keep the distance between those columns a little less, and then you will do well on that. Now, of course, that produces rooms and doorways that are not very wide, because as soon as you start increasing the distance between those posts, you are in trouble. So therefore, to really to offset that, you need to keep your posts closer together, beam small. If you really want to make a bigger structure than this, then one wonderful thing that you can use is an arch. And our ancestors actually began ingenuity is such, human intelligence is such that arches actually began to be made quite early on. And we have, I think, the earliest examples are from the Sumerians who lived in what is present day modern Iraq. And from there, you have some of the early examples in brick, but definitely of arches. And this is what an arch is. An arch typically is made up of a series of bricks or stones put, as you can see in this graphic, lying against each other in a roughly semicircular shape. It doesn't have to be exactly semicircular. In India, of course, as you will see in some of the examples I give, most of the arches in Delhi tend to be pointed. So they're not exactly this shape, but this is the only graphic I could get. So here what happens is that the way these stones are placed against each other, the way they are angled against each other, means that when you put pressure on this, when force is applied from the top, typically that's what happens, that's where the biggest force comes from, because the arch is supporting some other masonry on top of it. And when that starts to press down, then the nature of these stones and their placement against each other is such, my physics is not good enough to really give you the full story of it, but as it happens, the weight is a compression weight. These stones are not in tension, and as I said, tension is the problem with stones. They are not elastic, but they can withstand a lot of compression. So they are getting compressed. Those green arrows that you see show how the compression force is acting on these, and that red arrow which goes down, all the force travels, is evenly distributed through these pieces on both sides. By the way, this graphic doesn't show you the other side, but yes, it goes on both sides, and further down where it is, you have to give some supports to further stabilize it. So this is the benefit of an arch. It is a lot stronger in some ways than the post and lintel system. As a result, you can actually make arches which span fairly large spaces. So if you are making a doorway, you would be able to make a fairly wide doorway. Think of the Buland Darwaza. We know about the Buland Darwaza, which is a huge doorway, right? So that's the kind of thing you can do. You can make a big doorway. Moving on from this, the dome. This technical part will be over very quickly, and I just want to explain to you what it is. Now imagine that you've made a successful arch and then you rotate it. If you rotate it on its own axis, you will make a dome. So a dome is really just the extension of that arch along its side. So it works on the same principle. It again covers quite a bit of space, and this time it's all three-dimensional. There's a lot of space inside. If it is covering a room, you get a lot of space inside that room if you've covered it with an arch. So that is really, in short, the basic principles behind arches. Now, looking at ancient India, there's a lot of controversy. I keep receiving a lot of gyan from people about whether or not there were arches in ancient India. Now we of course see these kind of Chaitya window like features in This is from the Ajanta caves, and when you have this kind of a arched, so to speak, arched in inverted comma structure, then one immediate question arises: is this an arch? But actually, it is not, because this is not a structural arch in the way I have described. This is actually cut out of solid rock. All of this is one solid piece of rock. In fact, all that is beside it also is solid rock. So you have carved the whole thing out of solid rock, which is a huge, of course, technologically, it's a huge uh, task, and it's an enormous feat to be able to achieve that, but it is not a structural arch. So let's, that is, if there were arches, they were few and far between. We don't find lots of examples of arches. On the other hand, there were other ways of covering space. Now, this is from Morena district, the Bateshwar temples. This is one of the temples from there. And this really shows the typical structures that were made in India. I'm particularly taking this era of structure because this is sort of just around or before the time that that we'll be comparing some of the Delhi structures to. So this is the kind of foundation on which you would have. These are the kind of typical examples that you would probably have seen in Delhi. And those Delhi temples actually have disappeared, and I will talk about that in a minute. But what you see here is, again, as I said, the lintel and post system of a doorway, and on top of that, a tall and tapering shikhar. That shikhar is what covers the space. It does not have a flat roof, it has a high roof, but it has a tall and fairly narrow structure on top. It is not a very big temple. This is actually quite a small temple. Moving on. So what happened in Delhi? Delhi actually would have had several temples like this, and I would have imagined that a lot of them, they would have been big and small. Uh, a little bit about Delhi's political history at that point. What point am I talking about? From the 8th century onwards, Delhi was ruled by the Tomars, or the Delhi area, so to speak, was ruled by the Tomars. And the Tomars continued to rule Delhi for quite a while. In the middle of the 11th century, Anangpal II, it is believed, constructed Lal Kot, the fortification which is around present day Qutub Minar, Mehroli area. That's where Lal Kot was built by Anangpal II, a Tomar ruler. And he and his successors, and particularly one of his successors, Anangpal III, who was around 1130s or so, and they were Anangpal III particularly was a great patron of. He was a devotee. He was a follower of the Jain path, and he's patronized Jain temples. One of his ministers was Nattal Sahu, and Nattal Sahu was a very rich man, and he was a great merchant, and it is believed he was one of the people who patronized and commissioned this large temple in this area. So there were big and small temples like this. What happened was that by the way, Delhi was an important Jain center in 1166. Jinnah Chandra Suri, the Jain teacher, had passed away over in Delhi, and the site was also commemorated by a temple, and that is the Dadabadi Jain Mandir, which is in Mehroli right now. So lot of construction, particularly by the Jains, must have been others also. There are definitely others. But what happened in the end of the 12th century? Sometime during the second half of the 12th century, the Tomar seemed to have come under the overlordship of the Chauhans. Now, it is, of course, a fallacy to think that Prithviraj Chauhan actually ruled from Delhi. He didn't. He ruled from Ajmer, but it was definitely a part of his territories Delhi was. But whether or not a lot of building was commissioned by the Chauhans, it is not entirely known. Even the so-called Kila Rai Pithoda historians are divided about that. But be that as it may, by the end of the 12th century, in 1193 to be precise, Delhi was conquered by the forces of Muhammad Ghori. Muhammad Ghori, coming from a Turk coming from Ghazni in Afghanistan, and came and this was the start. It was actually his commander, Qutubuddin Aibak, who actually conquered Delhi. And in time, Delhi became the garrison town and then the capital of a growing empire, which we call the Delhi Sultanate. That very briefly is the political background. What happens during this moment of war in 1193 is that a lot of Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, whatever temples there were, many of them were demolished. And this was an act of war, obviously. Interestingly, some of the temples that were probably not demolished is the Dadabadi Jain Mandir, since we know that it continued to survive and the Jains continued to get a lot of patronage also from subsequent rulers, and the Jogmaya Mandir, which seems to have survived. Anyhow, that is beside the point. The temple pillars are then reused to make the mosque, because a congregational mosque is required, and there you have this image of the mosque inside the temple. Not only that, now these conquerors who have come, who are at this time only soldiers, they are basically soldiers. This is a conquering army that has come, and these soldiers need a place of worship because they are Muslim and they need a mosque in which to pray, and therefore they commission a mosque. Now, who will build this for them? It's obvious that it is the builders who are available on the spot, building out of materials that are available on the spot, according to techniques that they are familiar with. Now, these are the techniques that they are familiar with. Post and lintel, like you see in this part of that mosque, they put up pillars and they put beams across them to put up a flat roof. But the Turk commanders are a little bit more ambitious, and they ask that a arch be built. And when you look at this particular arch, which is there this is, by the way, in the so-called Quwwatul Islam Mosque. It's not really, that is not its actual name. It was just the Jama Masjid. This it's the entrance to this mosque, this particular structure that you see, this doorway. And it is extremely interesting because let me show you a closer view of this. There we go. Now, when you look at this, you automatically realize that the Indian builders who are making this mosque, who are trying to make this arch, and you can imagine the soldiers are not architects. They don't know how an arch is built. What are the principles behind an arch? They have no idea. What they know is that it looks like this. It has a sort of it's round and it's got a slightly pointy shape on top, and that's what they tell these guys to make. And the Indian builders, actually, when you look at this, you realize that they have no idea what kind of structure they are being asked to make. They don't know how this is made, and they are very doubtful about how it will work, but they try their best. And what they do is, if you look at the stones, and if you can see my cursor over here, what I'm showing you is how these stones, unlike an arch where they are angled against a sort of against a keystone on top, here all the stones are lying horizontally, more or less completely horizontally. And that means that the principles of the arch don't work. Here the forces are falling straight down. They are falling vertically down rather than being distributed evenly along the course of these stones. So that is not happening. And it's interesting that the builders, of course, they are familiar with building their own kind of building techniques, and they realize that this is not probably going to work, and therefore what they do is they add a lintel below it for extra support. That's what they do. So that gives a very, very distinctive look to this arch of the arch structure, which is not really a two arch, supported underneath it with a lintel. So this is what I think it completely sums up the Indian philosophy of jugaad. You have to do something, you will find a way of doing it, and that's what they do. They do a jugaad and they create this arch. The same is the problem with a dome. Now, if you can't make an arch, as I showed in that initial bit, that an arch rotated around its own around one point will produce a dome. Now, if you can't make a proper arch, it goes without saying that you will not be able to make a viable dome. And that's their problem. Now, what they are familiar with, if you saw that little temple I shared earlier, they are familiar with the shikhar. And how they make a shikhar is by putting concentric circles of stone, slightly each the upper one is slightly smaller than the circle is slightly smaller than the one below, and ultimately they all kind of until the gap is so small in the top that you can cap it with one stone and finish it. So that's the way they are asked to make a dome, and they are probably told that it's kind of round and it's not as tall as a shikhar, so make something like that. So that's what they do, and this is what it looks like from inside. This is just after you get through the doorway of that mosque, you come into this little chamber, and this is the dome that you see from inside, the so-called dome. It's not really a true dome. From outside, this dome looks nothing like a conventional dome. It looks like a conical structure because that is what it is. It's like a cone. Now, if this cone were elongated more, it would have, without making it wider, you would have got an approximate shikhar. But that is what is happening. The very first experiments in this concept of trying to grasp what an arch and a dome could be. And remember, these are people who are just struggling in the dark because there is no one to really say what to do, because these soldiers have no idea themselves, and there must have been all sorts of communication problems. Never mind, move on. Now this becomes very interesting because this is a structure which dates from again, I have to keep confessing this, I'm terrible at dates, but this is about 1229, I think. Almost a generation, definitely a generation after that first experiment with the arch takes place. This is the tomb of Sultan Ghari. Sultan Ghari was the son of Iltutmish, and he died in his father's lifetime, and his father had this grand tomb built for him. This is the doorway into the tomb. As I said, one generation. If you look at that doorway, it is built in around 1193, and this is about more than 30 years later. So quite a time has elapsed. But has it really? Let's look at more closely at the arch. What is happening here? Why is this arch no different in essential aspects from the arch that we first saw? So this is the arch that we see. Again, it does not, all the stones are lying horizontally. They are not angled in the way they should to be able to take that pressure of the weight on top. It's a very, very interesting fact, and it's quite fascinating that even so late we are still seeing this. And of course, because it is a structure like that, it's not got a true arch making principles have not been used. Therefore, again, a dome cannot be built. And because a dome cannot be built, you have this kind of very interesting conical kind of structure. It's been made slightly, the finish has slightly different from what we saw in the previous one, but it's essentially the same thing. Even from inside, it looks very much like the conical dome that we saw in the Jama Masjid of Old Delhi, Jama Masjid um, the of Mehroli, of Lal Kot, that old fortification, the first capital of the Sultanate in Delhi. Now, getting back to the doorway, just look at. I want to show you this for one particular purpose. If you look at the inscription that is written on this, now I'm not going into what the inscription says. I just want you to look at the way it is written. It is very sophisticated calligraphy. This is a very sophisticated calligraphic style. It was no doubt, it was written and executed by expert calligraphers. In today's day, we would call them designers. They are the designers who have made this template and have given them to the carvers, and the carvers have made, those who are carving the marble have carved it. Why am I saying this? Why is it important? It is important because I am suggesting that by the 1220s, when this is being made, almost 1230, by this time, it's a very different crowd which is there who are involved in the decision making process in Delhi. Now, it's not just soldiers, there are other people who have come. There are expert calligraphers, there must have been architects as well. And obviously, these calligraphers have come and they are the ones who have given this kind of template for these patterns to be made in this structure. What my question is, why is it that having these resources, these experts now have come in from Central Asia, from West Asia, they have come into Delhi. Delhi is now, has become the center, capital of a very flourishing empire. And therefore it's giving the patronage to all these people. And they have come and you have these resources, you have people who can do all this. Why is it that they are still not being able to make a proper arch? And for that, I feel that we need to turn to some other kinds of sources that we really deal with. And we should look at the kind of, and I always like to look at texts. I always like to look at texts. I like to look at what people are talking about. So, when I talked about the Jain temple, I'm looking at Jain histories. By the way, Jain histories are a very good source of information about the past. So the Jain texts are very important. But in this case, I would like to point you to an inscription which is there on the Qutub Minar. And I will go on to it now. This is an inscription which actually marks the date of the restoration of the Qutub Minar. The Qutub Minar was repeatedly getting struck by lightning and damaged in earthquakes, etc. But there was the lightning strike on the Minar during the reign of Firoz Shah Tughlaq. Now we are talking about the 14th century. This happens in the middle of the 14th century. I think sometime in the 1360s that this lightning strike happens. And Firoz Shah Tughlaq, who's by the way a great restorer of old buildings, immediately asks that this minar be restored. And it is restored. And this is one of the inscriptions which is left behind on the minar by people who are involved in this process. And look at what they are saying. And it starts with Om, and hail during the victorious reign of the illustrious Suratarana. Suratarana is Sultan. Firoz Shah, in the Samvat year 1426, the 5th day of the bright half of Phagun on Friday, the minar was renovated. The work was completed by the grace of Sri Vishwakarma. They are invoking Vishwakarma, the patron of architects. the architect was Chahada, the son of Devapal, and the maternal grandson of so and so, etc. And the craftsmen were the architects Nana and Salha, and the carpenter Dharm, Dharmuvanani. Now, this, pardon my pronunciation, it's probably almost certainly completely off, but you get the idea. In the 14th century, when the Minar is being restored, it is Indian architects with a long history of architecture behind them, steeped in the culture and tradition of their architecture, who are doing the repair work. When he says that he is the maternal grandson of so and son of so and maternal grandson of so and so, it's not just for anything. They are trying to make, the architect is trying to draw his lineage from a long line of eminent architects. So this is what is happening. Even in the middle of the 14th century, even by the second half of the 14th century, the building craft, the craft of architecture, is in the hands of people who have been doing this work for generations in India. These are not people who are coming from West Asia, who are coming from Central Asia. These are Indians from India who've lived in India for, so these are the people who have that tradition. Now, let me go back to the 13th century. So in the 1220s or in 1230, when Iltutmish has the tomb of his son constructed, these are the people, these are the kind of people who are actually in charge of the construction. And the reason why, even one generation afterwards, when we are almost sure that there must have been well educated in the architectural crafts, people coming from Central Asia or West Asia, telling these people that you can actually make, we can tell you how to make arches and domes, they are still not convinced, and they say, हम इसकी गारंटी नहीं लेंगे, आप जो बता रहे हैं हम अपनी तरह से करेंगे. So what I am saying is that the traditional crafts were still in the hands of Indians, the decision making was in the hands of Indians, and they needed to be convinced themselves that this was a viable new technique before they would adopt it. And by 1229, they had not adopted it. It comes slightly later. Sorry for the very long explanation, but I hope that it makes this a little bit easier to understand. I'm going to move on to the next slide. I said that it takes a while for the arch to begin to be made, and really the first example of the true arch in Delhi comes from the 1280s, from the tomb of Balban. And from the tomb of Balban, this image is a very interesting one, because framed in that opening, in the distance you can see the tomb of Balban inside. But this doorway is an old style doorway. It shows this is a corbelled opening. This is a kind of corbelled opening that had been used from time immemorial in Indian architecture. It was used probably earlier in wood also, and then certainly in stone. It has a very, very long lineage, this kind of opening. So what I'm trying to suggest is that Balban's tomb, even though the arch now, as we'll see just now, the true arch comes into use, this is not given up. This continues to be used. But moving on to the first examples of the true arch in Delhi, and we see it in Balban's tomb. The tomb itself is in quite a ruined state, but this is one of the arches which is left. It's a squinch arch. It's in the corner of what would have been the internal chamber of the tomb. So as you can see, if you can see it very well, I'm not sure you can, but if you can, this is, it shows the stones lying side by side as should be in an arch. We will continue to see many examples of this, but you can take it from me, this is an actual true arch. So 1280s is the first example that we see of a true arch in Delhi. Moving on, by the time we come to the reign of Alauddin Khilji, the early part of the 14th century, you see a complete, we have now reached a stage where the Indian master builders are finally convinced that an arch is not these guys just having us on, this actually works, can be done. So they have now adopted these techniques. This is the Madrasa of Alauddin Khilji, which is in the Qutub Minar complex. And you can see it has arches and domes. We will have a closer look at them in a minute. This, if you look at the arch, and I hope you can see the stones, are really perfectly aligned. It's a pointed arch, and pointed arches really were in use in India. That's what they invariably tended to use, not the rounded arches, the so-called Roman arches, but pointed arches. So it's a textbook arch. It's absolutely perfectly done. And because you actually now have arch making technique has been perfected, you can actually have a nice rounded dome as well. So therefore you can see on top a beautiful dome. Moving on, in that same building, you see a few smaller arches also, because it's a building which consists of several small rooms, small and big. And this is one of the doorways into one of those rooms. And the interesting thing is that this is an arch below which there is a lintel also. Now, why this? It's a very interesting, and one can speculate about this. My thinking is that that very first experiment at the arch that had happened in the Jama Masjid, when they made that, they had to put a lintel at the bottom for extra support, because that was not a very strong arch. And that in time became a sort of a stylistic element. It became a style. It became a particular, it became this a particular element which had no structural purpose. It did not really need that, but it was made simply because this has now become the fashion. So what they do is they put a lintel below that. Probably you can't see that, but that lintel actually has cracked. So it's the lintel which really can't take the weight of that stone, but the arch has. So this is just a little quirk that is used in this particular building. Also from Alauddin's reign, the Alai Darwaza, the so-called Alai Darwaza, which is a very interesting structure. For one, just look at the dome. It's got a very, you can see the dome rising. Of course, it's all nicely rounded, etc. But if you look at it a little closer, you will see it has a feature that is actually quite unique. And later it was not used in too many other structures, and therefore I want to point it out, because I want to point out some of the idiosyncrasies also. So this is a dome. It is a dome which is capped by another dome. The main dome has a hole in the middle, and that is capped by this marble dome. And on top of this is the Kalash. The Kalash, by the way, so this dome on top of a dome did not really catch on as a feature, but the Kalash, which you see here, this is actually an amalaka, this round disc with a stripy, like a discus with stripes, that is called the amalaka. And that really, actually, if you remember the first few slides I showed you, that temple, it's a very popular finish for a temple, a finial for a temple is this amalaka, and this amalaka was used in this. And if you move on, I will later show you more full amalaka later in another example. This one is broken. Other idiosyncratic features of this particular building, which is in many ways quite unique in Delhi, is a semicircular arch. Now this arch is actually semicircular. which is also part of the Alai Darwaza, as you enter it from the Qutub Minar. I'll just move on so you can have a closer look. Now, a closer look at this will show you, again, it is a proper arch, because if you look at the stones of the carved stones, not the plain stones, the carved stones, you see how they are lying angled against each other through the course of that arch. And that is a very, so as I said, even to the pointed arch, there are some exceptions. In some cases, round arches have been used, and this is one of those places in which a round arch has been used. Of course, the edge has been carved in another kind of slightly scalloped kind of finish, but that is another matter, but it is essentially a round arch. Moving on, the other feature of this particular building is that the arch, if you look at the shape, this is what is called a horseshoe shaped arch. It's horseshoe shaped because the ends of it, the lower ends of it, are sort of constricted. The base of it is slightly constricted in a sort of horseshoe shape. So this, again, this is one of the features of this particular building, the Alai Darwaza, which did not catch on as a very popular element in India, in Delhi's design. It was not used anymore. We can only speculate as to why this was so, but most of the, so it's not as if every fad catches on. You experiment with something new, some things catch on, some things don't. This was one of those that did not catch on. But moving on to the Tughlaqs, by the time we come to the Tughlaqs, and remember, I'm not looking at Tughlaq architecture. I'm only talking about domes and arches here. So, because otherwise it would become a very, very long, very long presentation. But this is an interesting tomb of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, very simple in its style. The dome begins to be really tall, rounded, and it has a very finished finial. The finial is not damaged like it was in the Alai Darwaza. And if you have a closer look at the finial, you will see at the base is an amalaka, that striped discus, and on top of that, a kalash, a pot. So this is the finial of the dome of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq's tomb. And this kind of finial begins to be used quite a lot. We see quite a lot of it being used. Again, I want to point out that that post and lintel system of covering space was not entirely given up. This is also within that tomb complex. You can see that this is part of the madrasa. There was a madrasa there, and this is part of that. And you can see the pillars. And again, the style also is very, very similar to the pillars that had been used since for a very, very long time in Delhi's history. So they are modeled on the same old pillars that were used. Again, this is the entrance to that little fortification in which the tomb of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq stands. And here again, if you look at the doorway, you will see that it has that arch with the lintel below it and a little bit of decorative corbelling on the sides as well. So a persistence of that particular style that has become kind of very, very popular. So it is continuing to be used. Moving on, this is again Tughlaq, but a little later, Firoz Shah Tughlaq's madrasa in Hauz Khas. If you look at the details, again, now this time the domes are particularly large and heavy with really heavy drums. So the rounded part is the main dome. The cylindrical part below it is the drum. And this drum becomes a very heavy construction in some of the Tughlaq buildings. And they are all supported on these pillars. So post and lintel still being used, but of course they have to put the pillars close together on the edges so that it can support that huge dome. And this is how a lot of chhatris, there are a lot of Tughlaq chhatris that have come down to us, which look very much like this. This is again from the madrasa. These are the small rooms in which it is believed that the students who studied in the madrasa might have stayed. And there again you see the continuing very strange combination of the lintel together with the arch. This is continuing over here. Also from the Feroz Shah Madrasa, very this is what we really call a sort of composite style in Indian architecture. You have the arch which is being used, but it is being used in conjunction with this opening, which is a very uh, it's the pre-Turk Islamic so-called Islamic pre-so-called Islamic architecture style in Delhi, the pre-Turk style which is being used. Moving on to the Lodhis. Now, the Lodhis left behind a lot of buildings. Again, arch and the arched openings as well as domes continue to be used. This is also a Lodi building. This is next to the Rajo Ki Bauli in the Mehroli village. And here, if you look at the dome, it has an interesting feature. It is ribbed. It's ribbed, but in a particular fashion. It looks like an sort of like a inverted lotus almost. The petals of a lotus, you can see that kind of feature. So this kind of striping, it's striped, but it's not quite striped. It is striped in a particular pattern which makes it look like a lotus. But at the top also there is a lotus finial, as we call it, and this becomes very popular, particularly from the Lodi period, and we'll see examples of it as we go along. This is from a mosque in the Lodi garden. It's called the Bada Gumbad Mosque, and if you look at the top of it, look at the, I think it's from the Bada Gumbad Mosque, or it might be the Sayyid tomb. Sorry, it's probably the Sayyid tomb. Forgive me. I'm a little confused here. But if you look at the finial, the top, the kalash is broken off. But if you look at the finial, it's a lotus pattern. And lotus, of course, is a very important motif in Sultanate architecture. As I said, this is not the time when I'll be talking about this, but it's worth looking at it from the dome point of view. This is a view of that mosque I was talking about. I don't think this particular finial is from this mosque, but this is the mosque. You can see the lotus finials on top. This is a Lodi period structure in Lodi garden. If you look at the arches, you see an interesting feature that has developed in these arches. These receding layers. It's an arch which is in layers. There are different layers which are there in this arch. So a peculiar feature which gets into arch construction in the Lodi period. You can see it, for instance, in other mosques, which like the Mot Ki Masjid. You can see it in slightly later structures like the Jamali Kamali, Maulana Jamali's mosque, and also the Purana Kila mosque. This some sort of layering that is happening in the arches begins to happen. There is no I think it's mostly decorative, the reason for doing that. Moving on. This is from the Mot Ki Masjid, again Lodi period, early 16th century mosque. The only reason I'm showing you is again the doorway, the persistence of that particular style. Then come the Mughals. Now, what do the Mughals bring to the mix? They bring certain features which they have a long ancestral building tradition in the old Mughal capital Samarkand, which was Taimur's capital. And what you see here is Registan Square. This is the Madrasa in the Registan Square in Samarkand. Look at a couple of features. One is this big sort of doorway. This is a big doorway. It's a projecting doorway. And set inside that doorway is kind of like a half dome. It's like a room, like a domed room that has been sliced in half. That's what it looks like. It's not only a big doorway, it's a very deep doorway. It's not simply layering of the arches, but almost a half domed room which is there, which forms that doorway. And as far as the dome is concerned, it's a very simple tapering dome, but it is placed on a very high drum. So these are essential features of the Temuri architecture, which the Mughals are familiar with and which they now bring, to India. Moving on, this is some of the early buildings activity by the Mughals in Delhi. This is the so-called Sabz Burj, which is in Nizamuddin. It's in the middle of that roundabout in Nizamuddin. A lot of people would have seen this. Now, this, obviously, you can see that it has parallels with that, the Temuri dome. It is a high dome. It is on a very high drum. It is tapering at the top. The doorways are deep and they are quite large. Those doorways are quite large. So it's projecting upwards a bit, the Peshtak. It has an interesting feature which the older Temuri, the Samarkand building did not have, which is the lotus on the top. You can see it is slightly broken, but it is there. And which shows that how early on the Mughal style also started to, it was not a Mughal, it was not an imported style. Yes, there were imported elements, but they drew heavily on Indian elements to adapt and evolve an architecture which is very, very, in a sense, indigenous also. One important feature is the material that is used in these buildings. So if you saw those Samarkand buildings, they were all covered in tile. Many of them are covered in tile. Now, in India, it was not tile, but there was a plentiful, beautiful stone, very skilled stone carvers. So all of these rulers, all of these dynasties, whether the Mughals or the various Sultanate dynasties before them, they actually relied mostly on stone for their construction. And this is a lovely aerial view of Humayun's tomb. And the reason I want to look at this particular angle is to see that Humayun's tomb also, the dome is actually placed on a very high drum. But whereas in the Samarkandi buildings, you can see the drum is very obvious, the height of the drum is very obvious. Here, something different is done. And that thing is, the drum is partially hidden, first by this projecting doorway, and from the other angles by a lot of chhatris which are clustered around it. So this becomes a feature of, these chhatris were of course there in earlier domes also. So the Lodhis, for instance, used them, the Sayyads used them. So if you look at their tombs, the main dome is surrounded by chhatris, and this becomes one feature of the Mughal dome, to add a lot of chhatris around it. And those of you who remember the silhouette of the Taj Mahal will know that it plays a very important role there as well. A lot of the chhatris clustering around the main dome. But otherwise, if you look at the shape of the dome, it is that Temuri dome, beautifully rounded, but pointed at the top, slightly pointed. It's as if it's been pulled up at that point with a string almost. That's what it looks like. But again, modified. So here we have, this is the Neela Gumbad in the Humayun's tomb complex. It at least has access from the Humayun's tomb complex. Again, and this time it's a tiled dome, because tile work was used from time to time. It was not used a lot, but it was used. And this is a tiled dome, and it is capped by a lotus as well as a very elaborate kalash. This is, again, as I said, the Lodhis had used it. Before them also it had been used, and it comes into Mughal architecture also very soon. The other half dome, or it's called a half dome portal. It's a doorway which is set inside a half dome. So this is one of the features. This particular doorway is from the Khairul Manazil Masjid. It's a mosque which is in front of the Purana Kila. It dates from the early period of Akbar's reign. So so it's from that period, middle of the 16th century, and this half dome portal really becomes, it's one of the hallmarks of Mughal architecture. If you see a building with a half dome portal like this, most likely it is from the Mughal period. Then we come to Shah Jahan's reign, and of course, one of the things that happens is this kind of scalloped arch. The arch, instead of being simply pointed, now becomes a very complex. It gets a complex edge. It is also called a datedar, uh, toothed. It's got like teeth coming out. So that is the arch. Now, this kind of a scalloped structure, we see some little signs of it in earlier buildings. This is from Iltutmish's tomb, and if you see that little scalloped structure, this idea of making an arch like this had existed. But this, of course, these are carved pieces of stone. This is not a structural arch as such. These are carved pieces of stone. And this is the mihrab in Iltutmish's tomb. So this kind of structure, the idea was there, but it had never been translated into actual arches. But with the Shahjahani period, you suddenly have a proliferation of actual scalloped arches used as structural arches. But it doesn't mean that other arches were not experimented with. You have a round arch, which is in the Khas Mahal in the Red Fort. So a round arch was experimented with further. Look at this is the Jama Masjid, of course. And when you go inside the Jama Masjid, and if you look at the domes, there's a further sophistication in the domes. So what happens is that the dome now has become slightly more onion shaped. It's become more onion shaped. It's become bulbous. It's bulging out from the dome like this. It's bulging out from the dome. On the top is a lotus, very elegantly made lotus. It's partly hidden here by these pigeons which are roosting, but it has an inverted dome, lotus on the top, and of course the kalash, which is a feature of, as I said, kalash finials have been a part of Sultanate as well as Mughal architecture, continued for a very, very long time. So we go on, 18th century. Now, the Shahjahani architecture really had a very hegemonic influence, which means that it influenced a lot of architecture, and particularly if you look at mosques, the Jama Masjid became such a sort of the template and pattern for mosques that came afterwards. And if you look at, this is a mosque of the 18th century, the first half of the 18th century. It's called the sorry, I'm having a senior moment right now. It's Fakhrul Masajid. It's near the Kashmiri Gate. And if you look at the domes here, again striped like the Jama Masjid, but even more bulbous than the Jama Masjid. So as time goes on, the dome becomes a little bit more bulbous. As far as the arches are concerned, the same scalloped arches continue. A little feature that, of course, had been there for a long time, even from Akbar's time, we see this particular thing, but not a lot of examples in Delhi, is what is known as the Bangladar or Bangladar, or it's sometimes called a whaleback roof. This is a variation on that dome and a vault, which creates this long structure with a vaulted roof. So this is a mosque in the Lodi Garden, which has this kind of vaulted roof, which is a variation on the dome. Instead of the arch being rotated on its axis, it is elongated, and that's how you get a vault. So that also is there. I thought I'll just mention it. The other thing that begins to be experimented, or it comes in, it's of course, it was used also in, I'm sorry, I forgot to put that picture up, but the Nashe-e Zille Ilahi, the throne canopy of Shah Jahan in the Red Fort, has this kind of Bangladar arch. This is this kind of shallow, wide arch is called the Bangladar arch. Again, that vaulted Bengal style arch that is made in stone. This particular arch is in the Zafar Mahal, which was built in 1847. That doorway was built in 1847 by Bahadur Shah Zafar in Mehroli. It continues. By the time you come to the 19th century, you're still having a lot of that typical Mughal architecture with those scalloped arches being made in stone. This is the Meru Mandir in Jain Mandir in Shahjahanabad in Old Delhi. But at the same time, there are experiments in other shapes also. And the colonial influence begins to have the colonial impact begins to have some uh, popularity, popular influence as well, and which is seen in this kind of shape. This is not a regular pointed arch. This is the shape is the proportions are much more of a Gothic arch, and a lot of the ornament also is Gothic in style. So a lot of public individuals are experimenting with new styles by the time you come to the 19th century. Uh, the domes, again, I am talking of the late Mughal, early colonial period. Domes continue to be used. This is the Digambar Jain Lal Mandir, which is in front of the Red Fort. It has a vaulted roof as well as a domed structure. These are the older structures. If you look at the shikhars at the back, these are 20th century, second half of the 20th century, these shikhars date from. So the persistence, the dome actually has a stronger tradition in Delhi than the shikhars. Shikhars, once they started making domes, then they didn't make shikhars till much later. This is one of the many shivalayas which are there in uh, the Katranil, which is the lane of the indigo sellers or indigo dyers. And this again shows you a very typical Mughal style of architecture. Now, that's why I would say that Mughal architecture is not a term that applies to Mughals, the architecture that the Mughals made. Of course, they made Mughal architecture also, but there were a whole lot of people who, it's a style of architecture which a lot of people followed. And not only Mughals, but other dynasties, rulers, other rich people, people building all sorts of buildings. So this is one of the Shivalayas of Katranil. This is a Jain temple, the Naya Mandir in Dharampura, and that too has a very typical dome, but its projecting balcony has a very different style which you don't often see in Delhi. But that is not, it's not an arch, it's a corbelled style with these very ornamental brackets on it. And then I will leave you with this particular image. I did not go into the colonial period because this is beyond the scope of this. But the 19th century brought in colonial styles as well. This is a sort of Renaissance type dome, I guess. I don't know enough about Western architecture to be able to say, but this is St. James's Church. So this is a sort of a synopsis of some basic developments in how domes and arches were made in Delhi, and some of the basic developments and some of the reasons why certain things happened in a particular way. I would be happy to answer any questions, which I will now look at. Starting from the beginning. Okay. Balban's, Arun Bhardwaj, is Balban's the earliest example of the true arch in Delhi? Are there older examples elsewhere? I would say that I am sorry, but it's just my ignorance. I know that it's the earliest example in Delhi, definitely. I don't know about elsewhere. Are there arches? They probably are in Western India. Certainly, there would be some arches, but I'm not very familiar with them. Anangpal Tomar Dushyant is the Rajput king, but why would he not? Why would he not be a devotee of and a follower of Jain traditions? I'm not. Definitely, that's what the Jain texts refer to. If you look at the Parshvanath Charit written by Kavi Sridhar, he definitely talks about the patronage given by the Tomars to the Jains. They definitely gave a lot of patronage to the Jains and had Jain as their ministers, etc. Nattal Sahu was a Jain, and he was definitely a minister of. So they definitely patronized them. They must have had some reverence at least for the Jain traditions also. Thank you very much. Uh, they are, yes, they are being saved. So please watch this at your convenience. I will save this. Was Delhi per se limited to Mehroli prior to the Khiljis? Not really. Mehroli was where most of the rulers, these early Sultanate rulers, ruled from. But even there, Balban's grandson who succeeded him, Kaikobad, he made a new capital at Kilokri. He made a new palace in Kilokri, which is Kilugadi, which is today's Kilokri village, and he built a palace there. And in fact, the first Khalji ruler, Jalaluddin, he was crowned there, and he made it his capital at least for the first year of his rule. So, apart from the capital, there was a lot of settlement around. I mean, a lot of Delhi's villages, I'm sure, have a much older history than Mehroli itself. And also, you must realize that, for instance, Ghiaspur, which later came to be known as Nizampur, and then Nizamuddin, where Nizamuddin Aulia came and settled. All these are settlements which are there been there for a very, very long time. Jami Masjid is specifically is the main congregational mosque for a city. So I would say, Shahbaz, that would be, there is one which is designated as a Jami Masjid in most settlements to say that this is and normally whenever any of these rulers founded a city, there was one mosque which was given that designation. Often it was also supported and patronized by the ruler. Definitely the case in the Jama Masjid in Shahjahanabad. So Shah Jahan actually appointed the imam and patronized that mosque. Yes, Qubbatul Islam was definitely, Dushyant, the name was given to that, but basically it is, it definitely, that was in fact, Delhi was called the Qubbatul Islam, which is the sanctuary of Islam. So Delhi was given that name also. So yes, from an extension of that, that's how that Qubbatul Islam has come. I don't think the dome is Muslim or it is an Islamic symbol. It is, it's a technological innovation. It's a technological innovation. As I said, the Sumerians 4,000 years ago began to use it, and the Romans used it. So there is nothing Islamic about a dome or an arch. And I, in fact, completely disagree with this category of Islamic architecture altogether. And that's why I try always to I try to explain how complex architectural evolution can be. We cannot make these simple categorizations. And I think some of this has happened because during the colonial period, a lot of colonial scholars made these kind of simplistic assumptions, arch and there is a Hindu architecture and there's a Muslim architecture. Our ancestors did not think that way. All the Hindus who were making the Shivalayas of Katranil, they used arches and domes because to them, arches and domes was not Islamic architecture. It was the architecture that they liked. It was the architecture that they were familiar with. It was their architecture. They didn't think of it as Islamic architecture. Or the Jain mandirs, when they built shikhars, or when they built these domes, or when they built the scalloped arches, for them this was not Islamic architecture at all. So I think that category of Islamic architecture is very problematic. So I would not say that it is a symbol of Islam at all. Palace and temple sizes would be limited. Definitely, you need to have, if you have flat roofed buildings, then you need to put up a lot of pillars. In fact, it's not only, uh, you have, for instance, you have uh, these hyperbolic descriptions of halls with 1,000 pillars. What is there? Kasares Hazar Sutun. What is the idea of this 1,000 pillars? It's simply that a large building, and because it is large with a flat roof, it has to have lots and lots of pillars supporting it. So you can have a large building, but then you'll have a lot of pillars inside it. And of course, the height of the roof will be limited. There's a limit to how tall you can make it. Temples is not quite so problematic because, as it happens, most temple worship is individual. It is not congregational. You don't need to gather a huge crowd inside a temple. So the Garbhagriha in any case is generally quite small. The actual shrine where you go in and offer your devotions, it's a small shrine because it's for individual devotion. So that's not so much of a problem. So they are typically where the complexes may be big. The complexes may be big, but the individual buildings are often of a modest size, not so very large. The Qutub inscription, it is this particular inscription, it's one of the stories, it's on one of the top stories, the part which was restored, the fourth and fifth stories, Dushyant was restored in the Qutub Minar during Firoz Shah's reign, and that's where this particular inscription is. Yeah, definitely. Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq's tomb. The session is definitely going to be recorded. I will save it. Okay. Great. I am just going through all the Amalaka and the lotus, which was used, when it was used, why one was used versus another. Some of these things are all about individual preference. There is nothing very, very highly rigid about this. It's like us today. We often make choices which are based on personal taste. Say, I want my house to be built like that, or I am building a temple, this is the kind of structure that I want. So I think this was to a large extent about personal style and taste. The Bangladar arch, that particular, the arch itself was in the Zafar Mahal in Mehroli, Bahadur Shah Zafar's palace in Mehroli. That kind of arch can also be seen in the gateways of the Safdarjung's tomb, for instance. So they are there. As far as the vaulted dome, that red mosque with the vaulted dome is concerned, that is in Lodi Garden. Kalash and a dome in a temple, they're not very different. A kalash is a kalash, and they are used in both. Okay, Ali Nadeem Rezavi has made this thing that there are, before the Delhi examples, there are no examples of true arch and dome. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you very much, everybody. Begumpur Mosque domes are actually proper regular domes. They are true domes, they are not false domes. There are many of them. Yes, they will be. This will be safe. No, I'm not saying that the soldiers are involved in the construction of the Jami Mosque. I'm saying that they are the ones who are probably commissioning it, and they are the only ones who are probably passing on the information to the builders as to how to build it. They are not builders, so they are the ones commissioning it. And these Indian builders are taking their instruction. They are the clients. So they are the ones who are saying, build a dome, build an arch. They are not building it themselves. All I was saying was that that's the only of the newcomers who have arrived in Delhi in 1193, that's the kind of people who are there. They are basically soldiers. They're not too many other people. The professionals have not come in at that point. The calligraphers, the master builders, the artisans, all those people are not there in that mix of population which is commissioning this mosque. Um, Sadhna Shukla, I would say that these are elements, of course, these are elements that are familiar to the Indian builders who are building these, and therefore they are including this kalash and the lotus, etc. But also, you must realize that they are building, they are including those motifs which are acceptable to their clients. So, for instance, they are not carving images, which they would normally carve. In the temples, they would carve a lot of images. Now, because carving of images is not acceptable to their clients, these new clients, therefore they are not carving images. So it's a give and take between the client and the builder, and that's how an architectural language or a language of ornament actually develops. It is that give and take of cultures, and this happens to be slightly different cultures here which are interacting, and the finished product is a product of that interaction. And why I stress this is because one thing that colonial scholars often said was that with the coming of so-called Islamic rule in India, then Indian architecture became, or Indian architects and builders became subservient to that so-called Islamic architecture and adopted an Islamic style. Whereas I give a lot more agency, a lot more independence should be attributed to the Indian builders. And that's why I gave you that particular inscription from the Qutub Minar, just to show how much independence the architect had, not only in building, they're building this minar, which is obviously, you would say that it's an Islamic structure, it's attached to the mosque, but they are invoking Vishwakarma. They are saying this is being made by the blessings of Vishwakarma. They are tracing their own spiritual as well as their social lineage to a long line of architects who have been building buildings with the blessings of Vishwakarma. So that has not gone away. It's all there. So we should be looking at those social and cultural aspects of these developments also. Delhi be a UNESCO. I think I will need to have a 2-hour talk for Delhi and whether it should be a UNESCO World Heritage City. Happy International Museum Day to you too, Adil. We definitely Delhi can be an open air museum in some ways. Yes, of course, and Russian churches have domes and so-called Islamic domes. Definitely nothing Islamic about them per se. Uh, you know, Shahbaz, it's a very interesting thing. You ask whether Islamic architecture took elements from various these things and no new invention. Now, Islam is a faith. Islam is not an architectural movement. Obviously, they are. It it influences architecture because the need for congregational spaces, certain those kind of considerations, the restrictions on the kind of ornamentation you can have, these are things that influence architecture. Yes, so therefore, yes, there is impact. But as I said, I don't believe in these kind of categories like Islamic architecture at all. And I think so. I think it's a very, very complex, and we have all cultures learn from each other. And who was the first and who was the second is often very, very difficult to sort out. And of course, if you remember, Islam is one of the younger faiths in this world. So obviously they were drawing on things that had already been invented, already been discovered. So that's what they did. Yeah, definitely. Kashmiri mosques didn't have domes, and it's definitely nothing Islamic about a dome. So, thank you, everyone. And I'm going to save this so you can, those who have missed parts of it, can come back and uh, watch this and hear this. And if they have any further questions, please add them. Thank you very much. Bye bye.